Welcome to the Simpleton Podcast. I am here today in Hyattsville with my friend Mary, who was featured recently in a history podcast, and our friend Ryan Haber, who you've met many podcasts ago and is back. And we are going to discuss the topic of Leninthink. A couple years ago, I heard this podcast interview with Saul Morson, and it was about how he's a professor at Northwestern, and the podcast was about an article he wrote called Leninthink, and how the thought of Lenin is still with us in the U.S. And I tried to get a bunch of people to listen to this podcast, and nobody wanted to. But finally, Ryan came across the Leninthink article and said, "This is really interesting. Have you read this?" And I was like, "Yes, finally." And so this article was written in 2019, and I think is still a really interesting, relevant read. Mm-hmm. Simultaneously, Mary had been telling me about this book called Waiting for Snow in Havana, who was written by Yale professor Carlos Eire. It is just a memoir of his childhood in Havana and being airlifted out of Havana in the Peter Pan.
Yeah, in 1963,
operation.
He was about 12.
Yeah, and I just thought that obviously there are overlaps, and I thought it would be interesting to discuss these things together. And Ryan and Mary both have formal training in history, but also are just students for life of history. And they're the perfect people to nerd out with about this. So let's go. The aspects. So in the article Leninthink, Saul Morson discusses some of the things, some of the aspects of Leninism, and the ones that stood out to me that I thought we should discuss is the abolishing of morality, or a materialistic worldview, partyness, how that played out in Leninism, and then the idea of whom, or zero-sum games. So we're going to discuss those three ideas, what they are, and make some observations, and talk about how we see them at work today in the world, while also tying in some of Carlos Eire's observations about Cuba. So great. So when we were preparing for this, the idea of being on the right side of history came up, and this is a popular phrase right now. And honestly, the first time I heard it, I was kind of convicted by it. I was like, yes.
Well, that's kind of the idea. It sounds
and no one wants to be on the wrong side of anything, right?
Right.
Yeah. But I guess, so can we talk about, what does this mean? And more deeply, what is implied by being on the right side of history?
The first thing, of course, is there's a right side and a wrong side, right? Mm-hmm. That you can be, so that it's not just we're all existing in time together and doing, muddling about and trying to do the best we can. So there is actually a right side and a wrong side. But then a right side and a wrong side of what? Well, of history. So what is that implying about history? That implies that history is moving towards something that's right.
Yeah. That we're going from worse to better, or better
we're going
to
from
worse.
Worse to better, and you don't want to be the person that's slowing down that trajectory of moving to something right.
Yeah, and also implicit in the idea of being in the wrong side of history is the sense that you can be putting the brakes on the rest of society, but also that your descendants are going to judge you harshly. You were the friction instead of the lubricant that moved history forward.
Right.
And there's a sense of inevitability to it too, that I think this is what you were getting at, that it's going to happen.
Yeah.
The question is whether you're on the boat or not.
Whether you are on, are you going to get left behind? Are you going to be judged poorly?
It's weird because it's like worried about like how will you be judged, but also sort of takes away like your individuality at the same time. Like it's like, are you in the right way of thinking or in the wrong way of thinking? Not, was I, Laura Heeman, with my given circumstances, trying to make good decisions at every junction? Right. Yeah.
I also think...
No, go on.
I was going to say, I also think that, we're sitting here and probably have a Catholic or a Christian audience, and, people are like, well, there are right action and wrong action, right? We expect to be judged as Christians, at the end of the world, at our deaths. But implicit, I think, in this phrase, being on the right side of history, is who is doing the judging?
Yeah.
History is.
Right. Our children
or our children are.
Yeah.
So you're like, okay, wait, where is this judgment coming from? It's almost like history almost becomes a person. Because if we're moving towards a good end, the end of history, history is becoming the judge, not in a Judeo-Christian sense, God as the judge. We're being judged by history and our children.
And this is Hegel, right? And Hegel is like not really a Christian in a meaningful sense, but he substitutes history and the dialectic for God and judgment.
Right.
That's actually, and I was going to say this, and I was afraid it was a little bit of a curveball. But I think we're all on the same page here that like, actually, I don't need to worry about what my children or my grandchildren are going to think. And it's a little bit, it's a little bit of, and it's a little bit, I mean, to put it into practical right now terms, it's kind of not great parenting to be too concerned with your children's opinion of you. They're children, know?
Right.
And you just have to do the best, and ultimately God will judge me. And that's whose judgment I should be concerned about,
Yeah. Well, I think another sort of interesting thing is like the idea of who believes in science or not, has been a political thing. But like an issue is like acting like there's settled science.
Right.
And it's like we're acting like there's settled history, which is terrible foresight.
That's like, and that's terrible history.
Yeah.
Do people even know how the history they think they know was written? Yeah. I'm sorry, that's the other podcast that you should listen to.
Right. No, but that's exactly right. Like it's like the old adage, history is written by the victors, but it really is kind of true. And like, there's all kinds of facts and details that you're aware of, and you just don't include because you have to make editorial choices, and there might be.
But it's also, I think when I used to hear that adage, it's like, oh, it's written by the victor of who won the war, but it's actually like written by the victor du jour, like
So being on the wrong side of history, so maybe, because I'm pro-life, I'm on the wrong side of history for 50 years, and then I'll be on the right side of history again, or whatever, Like, this is like, history is a very fickle God to submit yourself to judgment.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think what we're all circling around here right now is like history as like the things of this world. Like, where is the place in history for the things not of this world? Like, so is history and what we're talking about just completely a secular materialistic thing? Or is there a different component which leads us into what we're getting at is like a progressive or Marxist teleology of history versus the Christian teleology of history? So are we moving through time in hopes of a better society, right? And so we're on the right side of history because we've eradicated material suffering and, everyone has whatever they need. Or are we moving towards, standing before God, the second coming, and standing before God next to our brothers and sisters who maybe died in the plague 800 years ago or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So, or did we somehow create a society where the plague can't exist? So,
and I think I'd like to touch briefly on what makes this this kind of material dialectic view of history as a driving force with a teleology, a telos of its own. Like, what makes it plausible? And I think there's like a little bit of a sleight of hand or illusion here, right? Because like, oh, we eradicated this disease. So therefore, like things are getting better.
Yeah.
And a lot of things are getting better. Like more people live past early childhood than happened at any other time in human history, as far as you can tell.
If you get in a car accident, we can swiftly.
If you live anywhere near civilization, unless you're like in central Alaska, like that doesn't necessarily, it's probably not going to be fatal. It's just bad, But there's like, this is like a very materialistic reduction of what progress would even look like, whether, not to mention, it begs the question of whether there's progress or not. But it's a very materialistic conception of progress. What it doesn't talk about is morals. And here the materialists oftentimes kind of assume moral progress. And you hear that whenever they're criticizing the past, the implications that we know better now. We as Christians have to pause here because we know that for every one moral problem we maybe have solved as a civilization, we've certainly introduced new ones. Like there weren't concentration camps in the Middle Ages. There were problems, but we've made new ones.
Well, and even just like people still steal stuff,
Yep, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Like human nature.
Like even just on the like that lowest level, like, or people still steal stuff, and you're like, well, but look at all these social programs. Look at all this, like, well, I mean, maybe you had a rotten childhood and really were never taught better, but like we haven't gotten rid of theft. Maybe you have, tons and tons of money and you're embezzling. So you're still stealing, even though you're not starving.
Right.
Yeah.
So, even just looking at it at that level.
So it's like just treating, basic level, like ignores the heart of man. And it's just like treating like man as like input, output,
right.
Like, oh, this person is stealing because, wrong inputs.
Right.
That's very much Rousseau in the pre-French Revolution, right? Like man is born an angel and is corrupted by the other people in society that were also born as angels. Rousseau falls apart with 10 minutes of careful looking. But I guess so this is where we're like kind of landing on is that like progress, when you say, let's set aside material conditions of human life for a minute, progress starts looking pretty thin right off the bat. And when you look at material conditions, like, there's been a lot of progress. Like we have factories that make a lot of stuff cheaper than ever before. We've kind of solved the problem of production in a way. But like, is that all there is to human existence? Is that the most important part of human existence? Were people happy before they had cheap stuff from China? Is another way.
I don't know. I've always had cheap stuff from China.
It's impossible.
Same. But I do suspect that some people manage to find joy and happiness in the world before they could have disposable plastic toys. So yeah.
I think a separate question from like, is this like where we should be aiming? Is like also like, is it even possible? And I think going back to like the Leninthink article, he illustrates like just the brutality needed to get to that, like, progress free of suffering, so it's like a myth. It's actually just a myth.
Well, that's to bring it back to the article. He has this great quote in there, and I'm cutting out the middle bits of the quote, but he basically says that coercion was necessary because the project is to change human nature. And it seems human nature is changeable, but that everyone won't do it everyone won't just go along because they think it's a great idea. So they have to be coerced.
Morson notes that there were people naive enough to think that the terror, the coercion, the brutality would end once the project had been achieved, and Lenin was like, oh, hell no.
Yeah. It would need to be ongoing because there will be new people born who need to be pushed into this mold so they can be happy.
Yeah. So can you describe, Ryan, could you describe like Lenin's view of morality and maybe truth?
Yeah. And, those goodness and truth are always like deeply connected with each other, right? Because goodness is predicated on truth, I think. So for Lenin, the thing is moral if it advances the party's goals. That's it. And so he's he's instrumentalized morality. He's actually gone full utilitarian in a very narrow way, and so what's good isn't even stable. It's what's good right now, like what the party needs to do right now. And it's also not universal because it's ultimately going to come down to somebody's judgment.
He says very specifically in this article, there's a quote from Lenin that we reject any morality based on extra human and extra class concepts. So it's like it's not outside of the human like need, and which for him was the party. Right. So there's nothing outside of the party, or I guess probably even really just Lenin himself, that you could judge anyone's actions by.
That's right. And it's all in like this, in the concept that he crystallizes it in, particularly according to the article, I think, although I think the article is probably really fair, is the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Mm-hmm. And so even with the idea of violence as being extrinsic or contingent somehow, he's like, no, what do you think dictatorship means? It means smashing the opposition and using force to achieve the goals. That's it. And it's not going to be a temporary thing until human nature is fixed. It's going to have to be a permanent, ongoing thing, because human nature, for us, like this is a big cue. If it doesn't comport with human nature, then is it really the right way to go? Mm-hmm. For him, it was the obvious right way to go, and he was going to make it happen. And there's an irony there too, right? Because he believes that history is essentially a one-way train track, mm-hmm. and it's going to go there no matter what. Mm-hmm. So for us, again, the idea of forcing it is crazy. And this is one of the things that Morson talks about is like Westerners who think that they're really pragmatic and super like realistic and utilitarian about morals have no idea how thoroughly in his own mind and in the inner circle's mind of the socialists, they dissolved concepts like loyalty, trust, duty, honor, all these things that we take as the bedrocks of morality.
He talked about like how they would teach school children that those were vices.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Because they enable, they're essentially concepts that bourgeois uses to control you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I have a question about that so he says this, it's like really hard for like Western man to like really get their brain into this, and it's almost like you had to be in the mix a little bit to like know it and see it. But just with like Lenin boils everything down to like the proletariat versus the interests of the bourgeoisie, right? Like that's like the class struggle, right? Is like, but I guess like the relationship to truth is interesting because did he even really believe that that was the point, like raising up the proletariat when he's willing to like slaughter the proletariat, And I don't know what my question is exactly there, but it's like what Maxim did, like, I don't know, like what did Lenin live by? Because it wasn't even actually like proletariat,
Yeah, no, it was, I mean, his moral cynicism, like, and here's the thing, it's like really hard to be I don't know how you could be morally cynical about one thing without that spreading rapidly throughout your entire worldview. Mm-hmm. And the moral cynicism of Lenin in the inner circle is like hard to exaggerate. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of this memoir I read of Belladad, who was an Italian-American, and through the labor movement got tangled up in communism and ultimately became part of the inner circle of the American Communist Party, like in the Central Committee. And as she got higher and higher in the ranks, she kind of saw that they didn't believe it. And she had to make a decision about like, did she actually care about workers, or was this just like, had everything been instrumentalized? And I think to some extent this happens with Lenin. Probably I can't read his mind, but what she says about this inner circle is that literally everything had become instrumentalized to nothing because they'd run out of goals. Every goal they had turned into an instrument of achieving some other goal temporarily. Yeah. And so it becomes this raw power play ultimately, individually among the members, but also of the party.
Yeah. I think we can talk about the party. We'll table this for a second, but I think there's an idea in the article that it's like people who had like were attracted to the ideology eventually found that it was like empty. Like it's like if you believed in the ideology above the party, you were in trouble. Yeah.
And
the party actively discouraged that, and you wouldn't get promoted by doing that. Like,
I mean, you would get killed.
But once if they were in power, they would kill you if they needed to. Absolutely,
yeah. I want to go back to that, but first I want to talk about the reason why Morson wrote this article is because he's a little bit like he's kind of, I guess, has seen red flags. He's saying we need to ask, are some of these like Lenin's ideas, infecting our society? And are we seeing the fruit of that? And I guess, it's like, why would the U.S. And Leninist Russia, like, we are kind of like founded on like totally different values, right? So why would there be that, alarm?
There's something that happens in history where like the victors lose. And I'm thinking about like the going back to the Napoleonic Wars, right, which is like right after the French Revolution, and Napoleon gets beaten back, except that his system is adopted all around Europe, right? And you could even say the same thing. I don't want to get like, whoever says Nazi first loses, but like World War II was really about beating back this I'll go so far as to say unparalleled evil. And we've adopted so many of its ideas without even really thinking about it. And there's some boogeymen, like we haven't become a nation of radical anti-Semites, but that wasn't actually at the heart of National Socialism. There's like a metaphysics that's deeper, and we've adopted a lot of it. And and same with fascism of Italy, we've adopted the marriage of big government with big state. We've adopted the idea that it's like an us versus them, and that it ties in with a sort of neo-colonialism and a subjugation of other people to our interests. And so there's something like that. And I think something like this has happened with the international socialists as well, where like we beat them. The Cold War was one big long exercise in grinding them down economically. And yet we've adopted so many of their ideas without even thinking about it. And I'm not sure why that is. I just noticed the pattern.
It's interesting because, we can look at, like, say, we've been talking about how this Marxist materialistic view of reality has developed, right? And I'm going to say that the U.S. has a pretty materialistic outlook right now. And so how we came to that, in a sense, is like, it's almost like we've come to the same end, but through different circumstances, right? Historical circumstances. You have the U.S. as the victor after World War II, and they take their war machine, essentially, the factories that could build, all the planes we needed to defeat the Nazis. And by the way, the Soviets were our allies, right? So like, are they our enemy? So there's already a little squishy thing going on.
1984-ish, isn't it?
Because we had to ally. I mean, we were being pragmatic. We had to ally with them to defeat Hitler, to defeat the Nazis. Okay, so we take our war machine post World War II, and we're like, well, we don't need planes anymore, but now we can build cars for everyone to have. And and then sometimes, it's like it's said at the start of, every high school class, oh, this World War II got us out of the Great Depression, and so you're just like, oh yeah, right. But what are the implications? Think about that. There was like a decade where people had nothing. There was not a lot of food. People were selling off, had to sell off and move. Or they had no furniture in their home, whatever. Then the war starts, and there's like certain things like you're not buying, you're for the cause, you're giving up things during the war too on the home.
Giving up a new refrigerator and giving up a new refrigerator
so they can have a tank, right? So you have like a decade of depression, and then like this righteous sacrifice of things for the cause of the war. And then the war ends, and like now there's all these cheap cars, and you're really, really happy the war is over. And the war didn't really affect life in the U.S. I mean, all the poor families that lost a son or a husband. I mean, people were affected by the war, but it's not like it's in Europe.
Yeah.
When you have like physical devastation, we're not being bombed. And so we come out and we're like, woo, let's celebrate, right? With stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also really happy. So we're going to, we're going to thank God. I mean, religion is not forgotten like as a societal thing yet here in like the late 40s, 50s. But as someone said to me, as a historian said to me, it was a mile wide, but an inch deep. Yeah. So you have this so it's everywhere, but it's, it's not, there's no roots to it.
I actually, as a little anecdote to show that, a priest, I heard a lecture, an older priest who was a priest before Vatican II, who's passed away since, said that he noted this trajectory in confessions before Vatican II, shortly after Vatican II, and then say a few decades after Vatican II. And he said that before Vatican II, like confession after confession after confession was like, I used birth control again this week, Father. And he knew darn well that they were going to come back to confession again in a week or 2 weeks or whatever. But like, there was no intent to change their life, to bring into conformity with what they saw as their religious duty. It was purely transactional. I did this, so now I have to confess. After Vatican II, they just stopped.
Right.
But then give it a few more decades, and he said, like, and people are starting to discover like the treasury of Catholic living, of Christian living again, and being able to dig into that and actually trying to seek after the conversion. He said that confessions are just common, but he says that he feels that they're often a lot more meaningful than they were when he was 25 and a new priest.
So that's interesting. 15, yeah, I mean, you talk about everyone knew their catechism, but like, did it really penetrate? And, maybe that's why a materialistic culture could win out of this surface level, Yeah. I mean, we're talking specifically Catholicism, but like it was across the board. Like the 50s was like a high mark for religious participation across the board in the United States. And then it became something you don't talk about in public life,
Yeah.
Unless you're an evangelical, I guess.
Yeah. Right.
I think
a radical rightist. Yeah.
A thing that's interesting is like Marxism, Leninism. There's like a purposeful like adoption of like a materialistic worldview. And with all its implications and everything. But it's like in the US, it's like, have we sort of unwittingly adopted that? And I guess like there's like, we use the materialistic, like either philosophically, like that there are no,
there's no spiritual reality.
Beyond like kind of the material. And then we also use that in like, this person or this society is materialistic, as in, they like to consume a lot.
Right.
And it's like those meanings are different but related. And I think it's like, well, is the US like a materialistic society? Yes. Is that a symptom or a cause of like a materialistic worldview philosophically?
I want to think about your question for a second, but as you were speaking, I was like, wow. So the US, like, I'm just sort of like kicking around this idea. Like, it's like the US came to materialistic, like all of our problems, all of our answers can be solved by the consuming of stuff because we had an embarrassment of stuff, right? Post World War II. And then you have like the advertising. I mean, think of Mad Men, right? We're going to create this need through advertising that you can only satisfy by having a Coke or whatever. And so you have this this need to satisfy like your humanity through a consumption of the massive amount of stuff that's in the US. And then you have in communist areas, like it's almost like an adoption of a materialist worldview because you had nothing. Right. It's like, it's almost like this, I mean, they had really bad stuff. I mean, communist factories made really bad versions of things, right, that fell apart, but like they were still, but it was like, oh, we're going to satisfy your need, like you have nothing, and so you haven't reached your full potential, proletariat. But it's interesting that's like, it's almost like the lack of things create, does this?
Well, it does. There's an article that that's related, I think, but not exactly the same. It's called The Theopolitics of Ukraine. It's in the most recent issue of First Things. And one of the things the author makes a point of saying is that actually Russia is kind of the last country, like in the broader Indo-European sphere, maybe, where the state is still seen as sacral. And that wasn't in spite of the socialists. The communists really pushed the state as this guiding principle that was like too holy for ordinary people to address. And it was precisely because they sucked so bad. Like they made bazillions of rolls, like bazillions of concrete tubes that were cracked, but not enough toilet paper, Right. And so so everybody had massive concrete tubes for building roads that would fall apart, but they didn't have they would have like crazy disproportionate allocation of resources as a result. And that the West got so good at this, and because the West is such a democratizing presence, that we like democratize the sanctity right out of authority, and have come to see authority as really much more of a sham than even the Soviets really did by the end of the Soviet Union. Like the Soviet Union fell apart. It wasn't like a revolution of people saying you're not living up to the ideals, but it was kind of a checking out because they weren't living up to any ideals. They weren't doing their jobs. Essentially, nobody wanted to play along anymore.
Do you think the majority of people think authority is a sham in our country? Like, I think Americans have gotten very cynical. One thing I think that's interesting is that, and this is going to get into the partyness, and that we'll talk about in a bit. But I think that people go along when it's something that's like on their side. Yeah. But especially once the other side is in power, or if you can extract the conversation away from whose side it is. I mean, the polls are really conclusive. It's not just like Republicans because Republicans aren't in power, Democrats because they're in power. It's like in 1992, like 85% of Americans said that they trusted the government to do the right thing most of the time. Now it's like 13%. Yeah. Like, so basically people don't trust our public institutions.
Right. Yeah. Well, and of course, if you're hitting 85% in 1992, it's people from both sides of the party. Right. From both parties are saying that. Definitely. I mean, and that's like an insane amount. That's an insanely high majority, not just of your party, of the people, like of the. Yeah. So
I had the dates wrong. I just pulled up the study from the Pew Research poll again. The 80s is in like the Eisenhower years. Okay. And it falls off and it plummets to an all-time low in the 70s, which I think jives their experience. During the Reagan years, it goes up again, and then after the end of the Cold War, it drops. Actually, during George W. Bush, even among Democrats, it goes up. And then it's gone down steadily since then to a new all-time low. Wow. Of 9% of Republicans and 29% of Democrats.
It would be interesting to see.
That's a big difference, though.
Yeah, but think about it. 29% of the people whose party is in the White House trust the government to do the right thing. Right. Yeah. 29%. That means 70% of the people who presumably voted for the party in power don't trust it.
Right. Yeah. It would be interesting to see where the uptick. You said George H.W. Bush, or which one?
Yeah.
No, which George, dad or son?
He said son.
Okay, so it'd be interesting to see when,
No, that's when it was.
So like Eisenhower, you have Ike, you have the author of D-Day, right? You have this high moment, like everything's great again in America. You have the rhetoric of Reagan, it's morning again. And then you have 9/11.
But did it ever go up after the communists? Did it ever go up after weapons of mass destruction debacle?
Which one?
Like the whole Iraq War.
That one. Oh, yeah.
Like, does it ever go up after that?
It hits a high point in 2001.
Yeah. So it peaks and then.
But then it has lots of like local peaks, but it's steadily downhill for both parties under Bush. Down to 2008 when 19% of Republicans and 12% of Democrats. Wow. Which actually is higher than I would have thought for the party out of power to. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's if you Google like this is the thing I saw before. If you Google U.S. trust in public institutions, this Pew poll of surveys that they've done every few months since like 1958 comes right up as top search result.
How do you get in a Pew poll? I've never been
I want them
any of these questions.
I want them to poll me, let me tell you. I've got opinions.
Yeah. All right. Can you talk about this idea that Carlos Eire had about materialism? I'm gonna bring it back from our side.
I'm gonna just say that everyone should just read this book because it's a really extremely interesting, extremely well written memoir, and he's just like remembering his time as like a little boy in he talks about like his glorious childhood, right? I mean, it's like wild the way he and his brothers and his friends would like run around, but he's, in Cuba pre-revolution, but he's also very aware that like he's just a naughty kid sometimes, right? So there's a lot of presentation of his experiences as just like sort of a normal kid who does naughty things with his brothers and his friends, like, throwing rocks at, the animals that some guy on his street owns. I mean, it was wild, right? I'm like, this guy owns a chimpanzee. I mean, okay, so so read the book. But he's basically like this little boy who's having, one could say like a relatively typical like development as a child, an awakening of morality, is confronted with this revolution. And so I think that he remembers this experience of being told that like everything about his existence was wrong by Fidel Castro's adherence to Lenin, to a Marxist view of of the revolution that should happen, the uprising of the people in Cuba. And he talks about his uncle who owned a furniture store. And this actually, interestingly enough, a Chinese immigrant to Cuba, which I'm like, oh, there's a whole other communist thing going on there. But he doesn't get into that. I was just thinking, so this this Chinese man, Francisco Chan, I think, who owned a grocery store. And he had these experiences, like his uncle owned a furniture store. He used to love going to this grocery store. Because this Chinese grocer used to give the children nuts and raisins when they came in, I mean, how many times have our kids gotten cookies in like Costco or whatever? So just like, I'm like, oh, that's, and this is taken away from them because everything is owned by the state. So they can't have their stores anymore. Mm-hmm. Everything is owned by the state, their livelihood. So this human interaction that he had with Francisco and getting no more nuts and raisins because the nuts and raisins are now owned by the state. And his uncle, he recounts his uncle, when he knew his store was going to be seized, burned the loan books.
Wow.
That for the people that owed him money.
Wow.
Because, and
wow.
Carlos Eire has this sarcastic thing because he's like, well, the state would have been owed money to itself, right? Because like in Lenin logic, the state would have just had evidence that it owed money to itself. But the uncle burned the books to save the people from having to pay the money to the state. And he was punished for it.
Because the state would have obviously forgiven whatever loans it owed to itself, and it would have to cough up somehow. But the loans the state owed to itself, that you have to cough up.
That you have to cough up, right? Like, you owe me money, so we're going to hold you to that anyway. But so he recounts these stories of like, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine, right? The state, But throughout all of this, there's this human need for something more than just the materialist rhetoric that he's getting from Castro. And he often displays it in these moments of relationship, like with the grocer who gives things to the children.
Like he can't be generous anymore.
He can't be generous anymore. Exact. That's a beautiful way to put it.
It's funny because you just touched on something in the Leninspeak article where it says that Kennedy was blown away by Brezhnev's way of negotiating, where Brezhnev was like, our position is set and firm. That's our stuff. Your position is open to negotiation.
Yeah.
And that actually reminds me of my dog because I've got this meme and it's got this dog in a capitalist monopoly hat. And it's like, what's yours is mine. And then below it has him in a Russian hat. And it's like, but what's mine is mine also.
I bet that was in my head when I was describing this, but this is Carlos's observations of this transition from, and this transition of a Cuba where he, again, this awakening moral life and all of this rhetoric that in a sense is kind of what he was like as a 8-year-old boy. Like we're just going to throw rocks at the chimp because we think it's funny.
Yeah.
And now Fidel Castro is going to shoot blanks at the prisoners because he thinks it's funny to take them out for their execution. And then, oh, just kidding. We'll try again tomorrow. And so there's where Carlos is describing a need for something more, or that there's more going on in his life. An awakening of a morality, an awakening of awareness. The Cuban revolutionary government is essentially acting like, because of Lenin, the Lenin view.
Well, it's interesting, like you're saying, or what he's describing, it's like to fulfill this myth of like you'll be free of material suffering, you have to like debase the human person to a point of being comparable to your dog, strip them of all like agency of making good, bad decisions.
Right.
Or, generous.
And no room for generosity.
I'd like to tie this to contemporary events if we can for just a moment, because what we're getting at here is like this loss of morality, the subjugation of morality to accomplishing some goal that's meant to be so important that you can ruin everything else, including murdering millions of people. One of the areas that makes me saddest is to see this crop up, and I'm just going to call it like I see it, is the modern environmentalist movement. I'm thinking about like the Just Stop Oil movement in England, where they glue themselves to roads or they stop traffic, knowing full well and having actually led to people dying in ambulances. Not to mention hundreds of thousands of people being late for work and so on.
Right. And
they literally don't care. They literally say, no, but that's not as important. Decency, other people's time, other people's urgent life-saving, life and death needs aren't as important as this existential threat, the bourgeoisie dominating us, the Nazis, the communists, whoever the existential threat is. Everything is subordinated to triumphing over that. In this case, this impending global catastrophe.
Which it's individual people are never as important as like, and so let me say individual persons are never as important as, the environment,
as the cause
thing, as a cause. And I would say, I think that's a really, really interesting, thoughtful example to tie it back to the Marxists. It's like the people are more important than the person. Right.
Yeah, humanity is more important than individual humans, right? Or the proletariat is more important than the proletarian workers,
right?
As individuals.
Yeah.
No, that's right. And there's and that's just one example of the environmentalist movement. E.F. Schumacher is one of my favorite writers. He wrote "Small is Beautiful: Economics as if People Mattered," and one of the things he turned him off from the environmentalist movement because he was heavily involved in it in the 70s was he saw this kind of deeply pervasive. I go back to the 80s when it was much more fringe than it is now, and it was presented as fringe, whereas now it's kind of like It's whitewashed.
You have to be on the right side of history, Ryan.
Correct. And we're not. I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not. Of course I am. I definitely am on the right side of history. But in the 1980s, like Greenpeace, like loading boats filled with dynamite and trying to crash them into oil tankers to make the point. And that was the thing that they did, you know? And now setting, and this isn't a conspiracy theory, there've been arrests, like a spate of arson, like forest fires set by environmentalists who think that they have to do this for the cause because people won't get it otherwise, and throwing oil paint on oil paintings in art museums. There's like nothing they won't subordinate, some of them obviously, to this cause that's like so important that that all morality goes out the window for them. So I think, and I'm picking on the environmentalists right now, it's not just them. I think this is kind of the tenor we're moving towards in our society.
Yeah.
That might be a good segue into partyness.
Yeah. Beautiful.
So I think we've kind of touched on what partyness is, but do you want to talk about it a little bit?
So in the article Leninthink, Gary Morson says partyness is like essentially kind of like transcending the ideology. Like the party uses this ideology, but what it is, partyness is being with the party. And the party might even change the ideology. And the perfect example from Lenin's time is when it was clear that war communism wasn't working and that it was like mass starvation breaking out. He switched to the new economic program, which was basically reintroducing capitalism. And some people objected to this on ideological grounds, and he had them shot or committed to insane asylums because there's a certain logic here. You would have to be insane to like let all the people starve in the war and lose the war over ideas, you know? Yeah. And of course, then he pivoted ideas again as soon as the needs of the party changed. And people that went along with him the first time, they maybe end up getting shot because they went along with him the first time and now they're in the opposition. And so partyness is the idea that you stick with the party. What the party is saying or doing at the moment doesn't matter. You stick with the party. And so the author tracks Richard Wright, who was a communist in the first half of the 20th century, who kind of saw that the party didn't even believe the things it was saying. What it was saying was the words it was using were only tools. And he saw that, and he had to make a decision. His decision was to get out of the party. But a lot of people, they're not presented with that decision all at once, or they make the opposite decision where they say, I'm with the party. And like, you know, now we say capitalism, now we say socialism. The key thing is the party.
Yeah, he like, it was like Richard Wright I forget what was the example that he gave, but he had kind of like a jarring thing where it like the scales fell from his eyes, right? Where he was like, oh, this isn't about this ideology, it's about the party. But like you said, for a lot of people, it's kind of a slow process. And he also says, like, it's like if you grew up, you know, under Lenin education, it's like you're really young even when you make the choice, you know, to
and you are being, I mean, that's the thing, like education is, you know, you're being, to use a term Lenin wouldn't have liked, baptized into a way of thinking.
Yeah.
And so if you are 4 or 5 and you are being taught to think in this certain way, and that, you know, it doesn't matter, like you just have to agree with whatever the teacher says, and then you agree with whatever your high school teacher says, and you get an A, and, you know, or whatever. However, you know, it's going to take a really, really strong individual to realize that, wait a sec, what they said 10 years ago is not what we're saying now. And in a sense, I mean, we could say God-given, but in a sense that like there has to be like, I'm going to walk away from this because there's a truth that exists outside of whatever's being said to me today. But if you've only ever been taught how to think like that, forget about ideology. Like really what that would have been is like, we're going to teach you how to always think with the party. And this is what the party says today. So for children who grew up in that, you know, that's kind of an incredible, they had some really good teachers who were being used for really bad stuff. Yeah. You know, because they taught those kids to not question at all.
Yeah. But there's like sort of like, it's not just that they're not comparing yesterday to today. Like if I understood correctly, like there's kind of like an ahistorical aspect to
Yeah, I
it, that
think
it's just
so.
like whatever. There's not an idea of is this right or wrong. It's just like whatever we say today is what it is.
Yeah, and so it's like sort of like whatever happened yesterday, like forget it. What are we saying today?
Well, it's just whatever we say today is what happened yesterday, right? Like it's
yes, I think whatever we said today is what is the truth. And whether that contradicts your memory or we said something different yesterday, you know, whatever is happening today is your entire memory of who you are, who we are. And that, so yeah, that's very ahistorical because you're just, today is all there is.
It's a key ingredient, right? Because like, if I tell you one thing today, like let's say I say, you know, you need, I'm going to make up something that probably is not super controversial. You need to have a certain amount of vitamin D to be healthy.
there you go.
Yeah.
And let's say I pick a number, like this is the ideal number. It's like 1,000 units per day.
Yeah.
And then a year later, I come back and I'm like, hey, we have new scientific data. It's actually 500. 1,000 puts you at risk for having a bellyache. So like what we've done is we've owned the fact that we learned. We might be wrong before, we might be wrong now, but we've owned that things have changed. But if I come back and say, no, it's 500, it's always been 500. This is gaslighting.
Yeah.
And the purpose of gaslighting, just like in the original movie about gaslighting that introduces all of the concept, is to gain control over the other person, to get them to submit to whatever I'm telling you. And it doesn't even matter what it is. It's 2 and 2 is 5. The point is you say yes because I said it. You know?
And it's like there's like an absurdity to it that maybe I find hard to understand. But he describes in the article, like, it's like, well, when you're at the beginning of this process, it's like kind of like a weird thing to watch, you know, like what the heck is going on? But you learn your canned answers that are like appropriate, you know, or acceptable. But later down in the process, like if you grew up in it or just were more steeped in it, you're not any longer asking like, wait a second, am I supposed to say 2 + 2 is 5 even though it's 4? You're just like, tell me what 2 + 2 is. Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
You know, and
you
there's not
start
even
to
like
believe
that.
you believe the thing, which is like against all evidence of a material difference.
Have either of you seen the movie or the HBO miniseries Chernobyl?
Love it. You have to.
I have. Okay,
it's so great.
You have to. It's so good.
Yeah.
There's this great moment in it, right? Where, so slight bit of background is that the power plant is powered by nuclear uranium rods that they can like raise up out of like this waffle type setup and expose them to each other, creating more reaction and more heat, or they can lower it back down into this like honeycomb type setup. The honeycomb material is made out of graphite. And so if there's been a meltdown, there's like one kind of problem. If there's been an explosion, then you would expect graphite to be everywhere. An explosion is much worse and much harder to control. It's like that's out of control now, right?
Yeah.
And so right after the problem erupts, one of the workers comes down. He had gone up on the roof, saw a huge hole in the roof, and seen chunks of graphite. And it's a very distinct shape because it's like a honeycomb shape almost, you know, like Legos with holes in it. And he comes down and he says to his supervisor, he's like, there's graphite in the roof. There's been an explosion. And the supervisor says to him, there's no graphite on the roof, because that would mean there's been an explosion. Because like I saw, it's like, you didn't see anything. What he's being told is essentially to follow into the party line that the supervisor is setting, because for the supervisor's career and for the career of all the people above him, it's better for this to be a fluke or a meltdown or a malfunctioning test than it is for it to be an explosion.
I think the mini series really illustrates this idea well, like of people believing what they, because like I said, it's hard to understand. And for me, this mini series kind of got me into the mind of it a little bit. But it's like a thing that's like, you can just verify it. Like you could just go and verify it. And for days, they don't know if there's been an explosion or not, because it would be inconvenient to the party to verify if there's been an explosion, you know? Yeah. And you see this.
It's probably like, it's like they don't even bother actually verifying it. I mean, I guess that maybe in this series, like one guy did, but are they even bothering to verify it? And
it's
why?
Kind of like,
or are they
just
just making? They're just like making up what they want to have happened. They're not even like covering up in a way. Is that what that what it was?
I want to give a little So
Yeah.
carry on your point.
The
Sorry,
whole miniseries, which I mean, it's like it's based on history, right? So I guess the idea of giving away what happened, but I don't want to say too much because people really should
so
watch
good.
it.
Yeah.
But it's like this was like this huge crisis that boiled down to two things. One is like the crappy stuff that Russia was manufacturing, but then the even bigger thing at play is like, what do you believe is true and what are you allowed to believe is true? And even like when they're getting aid from other countries, they are giving like the party information instead of like the actual information that would like let them get actual good help, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's because, you like there's a certain kind of movie, like the whistleblower movie, like the person that's going to like go against the people that are lying, to expose the thing. But they're in those types of movies. I'm thinking like, what's that Russell Crowe movie? He gained like 35 pounds. Like, right. He's like a whistleblower. There's this sense that people are lying and he's going to expose their lies because there is a truth.
Yeah.
It can be exposed.
Yeah.
And this sounds to me like something different, right? Like we're not lying for the sake of covering up. It's like we're willing to sacrifice the people for what we want to have happened. Like it strikes me as like there's something different going on here than just lying to cover up something.
Exactly. It's not because it's not like
Well, I think the two are together. It's embarrassing, and that's the reason for covering it up. Like,
and Morson talks about that because, like, in our minds, like in the Western mind, not any of the three. I think the three of us think lying is bad, right? So, but it's like in the Western mind, you might say, like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't remember if this is from the article or from the podcast I listened to where he was being interviewed. So maybe this is either Morson or this is his interviewer in the Moral Imagination podcast. So, but anyway, there's this concept of like, well, Russia is lying, but, don't we all lie a little bit like to serve a higher purpose or a greater good, or we cover up something. But the idea is like, well, lying isn't great, but you are trying to achieve something else. And so you'll use it as a means to this end. Right. In this, it's like you're not lying, which it's just like doesn't.
Yeah, it's like but there's something else going on here.
Yeah,
because even in all those whistleblower movies, like the person who lied, like they make them like even just at the tiniest bit sympathetic. Like, oh, we were trying to protect someone. Oh, sometimes they're really like just out for big business, but sometimes there's like the lie started off as like innocent and then grew bigger, and that's why you need this truth person. There's no versus but it's like really hard for us to wrap our brains around that, like the lie isn't the point, it's the party is the point. Or something,
but I think actually the two they still go together. There's a difference. I think you're right about that.
Yeah.
But like the thing starts off maybe selfless enough, but it ends up becoming selfish. And I would say it always has that seed in there. It was always because it's easier and more convenient to tell the lie. And to give us a little bit of whiplash right now, officials in Hawaii have a list of all the people still reported missing. They refuse to say how many of them are children. They just refuse.
Yeah.
Why? The only reason I can draw, I'm deducing, and I might be wrong, is because it will be shocking and upsetting to people. Yeah. And
it will reflect bad on local government, on the
response.
National government, federal government.
So whenever we lie to protect somebody else, I think that's suspicious. Unless you're talking about actual children, it's not really your job to protect other adults from the truth.
Yeah. Yep.
That's their job to handle the truth.
Yeah.
Well, and we might get angry.
We
might get angry at the government.
Which is inconvenient. Yeah.
Because if you tell us that you irradiated 1,000 square miles of farmland and made it uninhabitable for 100 years, we might get angry at you. We might get really angry at you, actually. Yeah. We might do to you what you did to your predecessors. And that's the reason for the lie.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Can Can you, there was an interesting thing about Carlos Eire visiting, like seeing this Russian cosmonaut.
So and this is like right before he's about to leave Cuba. So his mother has like worked tirelessly to get him and his older brother tickets out of Cuba into the US. So there was, I don't know a lot about it, I should go read about, but a Pedro Pan, like airlifting children out, often separated from their families. Their parents came later. And I think it happened over like several years. But the mothers worked tirelessly to get tickets for Carlos and his older brother. So he knows he's leaving, but before he leaves, the Russian cosmonaut, Yuri, and he just keeps referring to him as Yuri in here, Yuri Gagarin comes to Cuba because he has been to space. And so Carlos, this little boy, he's like, oh, I don't care. Like, he hates the communists at this point, but he wants to see someone who's been to space. So he goes to hear the maximum leader give a speech from the Plaza of the Revolution. And it's interesting, some of the words he chooses. So I can't read the whole thing. That's why you all who are listening to this have to go read the book. We were all being bombarded. I shielded my brain from the maximum leader's words. And for most of the day, I succeeded. The words bounced off my ears and fell to the ground, mortally wounded, gasping for meaning. But every now and then I'd let my guard down and a few words would get through. Revolution this, revolution that. Yankees are evil. Fidel is great. Hail to our maximum leader. He's given us genuine freedom. All are free now, truly free. We shall build an ideal society. We shall all think alike, think freely, think as one with our leader. Revolution this. And so then he gets to see Yuri come in. And this is, so this little boy is being bombarded with this message, and he's just a little boy, right? Who goes with his grandfather, and he notices, wow, this really pale Russian is getting a sunburn in the Cuban sun. And Yuri was surely getting one hell of a sunburn in the back of that convertible. Come to think of it, his face was the same shade of red as any references a movie. But he was a genuine sport. He waved back at the crowd with a goofy grin on his face. Not quite as goofy as Eisenhower's on the cover of my new American record album, but goofy enough, especially for a hero. I waved at the goofy, atheistic Russian space hero, and he waved right back. Contact. I was one with history. It's so interesting because here you have his memory. He's he's rejecting this communist ideology. Like, Fidel's words need to be meaningless. Like he's shielded himself from them. But he is in this moment in time where he sees it's both incredible because of, wow, a man has been to space, right? That is incredible.
Yeah.
Right. And he got to see that man. This is bringing back to like, what is history that he's won with here? Yeah. Right. He's like, he has entered into this communist narrative for a moment to see this man that went to space, that had this progress. And then he ends the chapter by him and his grandfather start to really be frightened because they really understand what Fidel is saying. The bourgeois is bad. We're going to be free. And he leaves the plaza. He and his grandfather have got to get out of there. They can't listen anymore. And his grandfather says, hold my hand. And he says, I was really too old to hold his hand, but I did it anyway. And the unspoken thing is because he was afraid, right? They had to get out. And then he says, this was actually the last time I held my grandfather's hand. And so there's this moment of personal connection, like his relationship with his grandfather. They fled this together, and he never, he was gone and he never held his grandfather's hand again. And so, wait, he was one with history. What piece of history was important here? Was it the cosmonaut, or was it that this was his final moment that he was graced with this final moment with his grandfather. And this is what his memoir does. It constantly sets these, materialistic, scary moments of this revolution that tore his family apart and tore his culture and society apart. And then he sets it with the grace of whatever God sends him, which sometimes is not pretty grace. Like it's very nice to hold your grandfather's hand. But sometimes the moments of grace are not as comforting.
It's interesting that, like, kind of compared with, like, the reality of his relationship with his grandfather and, like, his grandfather's hand, and that, like, he still needs to protect himself from the words, like, from being kind of infected by that. That's, like, it's really interesting that words that even if they don't match up with reality, even if they're ugly, like, can affect you.
Yeah. He was being bombarded, right? So, I mean, he's describing, in a sense, what we've been sort of more, like, logically going through. Like, they just keep saying this. They keep teaching you. They keep teaching. And he's having, he was bombarded with these things. Yeah. It takes a really strong person to say, no, these are not correct. Yeah. And I'm not going to believe them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And thank God he got out.
Yeah. Still in the topic of partyness, but I want to switch gears a little bit. So Morson, like I said, he wrote this article in 2019. So he says, when Leninism is significant, there will always be a spectrum going from those who really understand to those who just practice the appropriate responses to those who are entirely innocent. The real questions are, is there such a spectrum now, and how do we locate people on it? And if there is such a spectrum, what do we do about it? So that's kind of like, I think that, that's why he wrote this article. And I think he talks about this moment where he had a student say to him in class, like, oh, well, that's not true because it was reported on Fox News. And he was like, whoa, that's crazy. Like, it's just an example of partyness. And I think we all, depending on what side you fall on, you might be suspicious of CNN or you might be suspicious of Fox News or whatever, and have that kind of reaction. And I think it's interesting that since he wrote this, we've had, like, the Twitter files come out. We've had the creation and dissolution of the Disinformation Governance Board, which sounded like a joke when I heard it. Like, it was
Orwellian.
Yeah. And just, like, we know that, like, we have people deciding, like, what is misinformation and that's being monitored and suppressed. And that's creepy.
So I think this is happening. It's been happening longer than we probably like to think it as. Yeah. I'm going to take a safe example and say weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Like, some people knew what the real situation was there and knew what was and was not in Iraq.
Yeah.
And then a bunch of people parroted what they were told to say.
Yeah.
And then a bunch of people kind of went along for the ride, And
it's, like, unclear even at what level.
Yeah.
Who knew and what didn't know, didn't
yeah, exactly.
know.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm going to fast forward to something that is a little bit more charged, but just a bit more charged. Don't be too worried. Is COVID masking. Where Fauci said, do not wear masks.
Right.
And he later on, he said that the reason was because they're afraid there would be a shortage. So he lied to achieve some greater good, which is a lie, Yeah. And then he said you have to wear masks. And then data came out saying that masks didn't really add much value or any value.
Especially because they didn't distinguish between what masks you needed to wear. Mask? Like, I really liked my Christmas plaid mask from Old Navy.
Yeah.
That was my favorite one to wear.
And that's not the same thing as a gas mask.
Yeah, that's an N95,
so,
Yeah,
or which is somewhere in the middle, right? So,
right.
So masking, but there were people who knew this all along. Who knew this? The people who were in charge of things and telling us to wear masks, but still constantly being seen in public without masks at dinners at fancy French restaurants, at baseball games while telling us to mask even outdoors, at parties with their friends, having cocktails. oftentimes while having the wait staff wear masks.
Yeah.
And like, and then there's a whole cadre of people who said, well, we have to do what's right.
Yeah.
Because we're being told, this is what we're being told, we have to do it. And then a whole other.
Well, and not even questioning like, oh, is it just that you really needed to be like you were giving a public statement and you needed to be heard clearly?
Yeah.
You know, it was just like, why would you even question why so-and-so took their mask off for a second? Like, you know, I mean, so, you know, or in the more, you know, egregious like restaurants. But, you know, I mean, like.
Well, and so
we weren't even allowed to say what are the parameters here for wearing or not wearing, or
it was just an example of like something being enforced that you weren't sure if the public officials enforcing it like really believed in it or not.
Yeah.
Right. And I think some of them did, and some of them obviously didn't because their behavior like displayed differently. But I think COVID is really interesting. I don't know that I've like witnessed something like COVID in my life where it just like broke social lines.
Yeah.
Like so drastically and quickly. And it's just like you fell on one side or you fell on the other. And maybe with a tiny bit of nuance pulling you to the other side or not, you know.
Well, and it felt like if you even tried to straddle the divide,
you were a traitor,
that you were or that it was just like totally impossible, like say, okay, you know, this is like kind of an interesting situation, like, you know, XYZ, you know, there are people who have, you know, compromised immune systems, or what do we do about the fact that like when COVID happened, you know, like COVID at the beginning was the same as COVID at the end, and we're like, well, that's like really not true. I mean, there were so many different strains and we didn't know, you know, we thought, you know, but we are not allowed to talk about how our knowledge even of the virus, like, you know, changed, and it was different at the beginning to the end. I mean, so it's like, we still can't even have these conversations because there were people just like to the contrary of all evidence claiming the same thing that they'd been claiming for, you know,
since the beginning
18
of it.
months.
But I think like an interesting thing about COVID, to bring it back to Russia, is like, and Lenin, is that there was like the aspect of terror.
Yeah.
You know,
Like
you could die, your kids could die, your grandma could die. Like
not just your grandma could die, you could kill your grandma.
Yeah, you could kill your grandma. Right. Yeah. And you will die alone in a hospital, you know. I don't want to maybe get into if that was purposeful or not, but either way, it was like a vehicle for that fear was a vehicle like for controlling how people acted, you know.
I can't speak to the United States, but it's actually kind of this like low grade ongoing scandal in the United Kingdom where the mandate given to a particular advisory body was literally to figure out how to harness the fear in order to gain adoption for the measures.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that seems innocent in a certain sense. Like, this is good for you. Like, this is a plausible scenario. This is good for you. So we need to figure out how to use fear to get you to do it. Yeah. The question of whether fear is a legitimate tool, fear as a form of coercion versus like explaining and trusting people to be adults. And well, it's a like, question of whether it's actually good for you or necessary,
and it's like contemptuous.
Yeah, it's very contemptuous.
Like, you know, I'm going to control you the way, you know, parents might say, like, if you don't brush your teeth are going to fall out, which like they're not going to fall out tonight. But if you don't brush your teeth, you're probably going to get cavities, right? But I mean, and like, you know, like you can't really explain to a 4-year-old like how cavities work, right? So, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to get into a parenting debate and whether, but I mean, like you could see where like you use that because you're like, this child can't understand the mechanism of a cavity. And so you're like, I'm an adult. This person that has been entrusted to me can't understand the mechanism of how disease spreads. So I'm just going to scare them.
Yeah. There's a woman named Laura Dodsworth who's written extensively about this committee. Its acronym is SAGE, Wisdom, which is funny, SAGE in the United Kingdom. and how they were very openly advocating for the use of fear as a lever to gain public compliance with different measures.
I mean, we saw shame was used, right?
Yeah.
Too.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty openly.
Yeah, and shame is also extremely powerful. People murder over shame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think when I first heard this podcast, what was kind of fresher on my mind at that point was just like kind of the rash of like canceling, you know, and I don't know. I think people are maybe growing a little bit more immune to canceling, and maybe not in all spheres, but I think people. Yeah, I don't know. I get the impression that people are becoming less afraid to speak out, you know. I think it still might be difficult in some fields of study or whatever, but I do get the impression that maybe we're entering into a different phase of that. But
I think the pushback against cancel culture has begun. I think that's true.
Right.
But I think so Jordan Peterson can say to, like, there was just a court ruling against him essentially saying that his psychological licensing board has the right to revoke his licensure over political speech because he has to play by their rules. That's what the court ruling said. So he can say Justin Trudeau is a bad prime minister and then have a quasi-governmental body punish him as a result. Yeah. And that's okay under this Canadian court ruling, and we'll see how it plays out down the line. Jordan Peterson can accept that loss because he has other income. I don't know if he's independently wealthy yet, but he has other streams of income, certainly, that will support him and his family just fine. But there were people who fired over far less contentious positions, or who say things that are contentious, but I think most reasonable people wouldn't say are evil. They're not advocating violence or anything, you know?
Right.
And who lose their jobs. And it's actually really hard to recover from.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think and maybe part of the, you know, maybe there was kind of like a period of silence before people figured out how to pivot, you know, and there's like university professors who I never would have heard of, except that they were canceled at their schools, you know?
I know.
And now like their writing has had a bigger impact, you know, because they are known, or even like the journalists that left mainstream media and have made a much, much better, bigger living, you know, on Substack or other. So that's kind of interesting. Like,
the terror and the coercion don't need everybody to get shot. They need some leaders to get shot and then need a random smattering of other people. So you think it could be you. This is what Lenin does, right?
Yeah.
And so we don't need to get people to be quiet with their opinions. The people in power don't need to fire everybody and exclude them from the economy and debank them and cut off their social media presence and smear them. They just need to do that to a few leaders.
Yeah.
And as long as they don't come out and say, we're doing this because you disagree with us politically.
Yeah.
Then the ruse works. We're doing this because you're a bad person. You're probably a pedo. You've stolen. You've done all these things wrong.
You've created a hostile work environment.
Yeah. You've made us feel unsafe. Yeah. And you can say all these things to people and then never come out with any real clear accusations. And then that person suffers immensely as a result. And then for every person that's victimized in that way, 19 other people are afraid of having it happen to them and kind of fall into line. Yeah. So,
yeah, I read this. Carlos Eire said he was like disinvited from a speaking event because he was like represented like Cuban American interests, and I guess I think there's been growing sympathy for like Cuba in our country, and we're like kind of the evil imperial Yankees.
For
the Cuban regime, not for the
Cuban regime, not I'm sorry.
Well, I think people don't understand that they are different as part of the thing. So it's like Carlos Eire, who can like give you some firsthand accounts, you know, from himself, his family, is not to be trusted, and this like other narrative is what people are accepting. But I so like the idea is like Cubans who like leave Cuba are greedy and they don't like want to participate in the like beautiful communist project that is, Cuba.
And we can't trust what they say about their experience too. Like there is that like don't. It goes back to the truth. Like we're gonna believe, like you're standing in front of me, but I'm not gonna believe anything you say because it's not the party line.
Yeah, and I think it's like it's like things are terrible in Cuba. there's like no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Like things are terrible in Cuba. People are suffering in Cuba. I can't like take seriously any idea that it's not. But like let's say Carlos Eire, it does not sound like, but he could be like a greedy person or something, like there's just like no room for like a multifaceted story about Cuba. Like it has, I'm sorry, Carlos. That's not really, but it's just like there could be people with different interests that have something to tell you about what is happening in Cuba, but we can't. It's dangerous to have like a multifaceted story about it. It's like weird.
Right. Yeah. And like just because there was maybe one person who managed to get their family out of Cuba like right after the revolution happened and hold on to their wealth for, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there was probably one. Just because like doesn't mean that, this is what you're saying, right? Like they're all individuals. They all had this experience, but collectively, I'm looking at this article over your shoulder, 20% of Cubans are in exile from Cuba. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
Well, and this is why, like, when you sympathize with Cuba, that is the regime, like you're cutting off empathy and trust and belief and credibility towards all the people who have come thousands per year, including this year, saying, no, it's not good. The regime is not good. It's a totalitarian state that controls and dominates for its own purposes. And you're ignoring all those and saying, no, you're wrong. There's no graphite on the roof.
Is it easier for Is it easier for us to just go ahead and believe what their state says? Because otherwise we'd actually have to like dig into the personal stories, like and actually do something about it, or I don't know, maybe not do something about it. But we don't want to have to deal with the suffering, which goes back to like, we don't want to have to, we want a society without suffering. So when we're confronted with suffering, we don't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
Well, I think our leadership is statist by inclination, and they sympathize with the statist operations of the Cuban regime.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, it's unclear to me. I think part of what you're saying is right. And then also someone has a vested interest. Let's talk about
great minds think alike.
Who?
I knew. Yes.
This was not a. I like didn't really remember this concept from like high school learning about Lenin, and I didn't even really know what a zero-sum game was until a few years ago. But when I heard him describe this in the podcast, I was like, it's everywhere. But Ryan, do you want to like explain whom, and what a zero-sum game is, like this idea?
Yeah, I'm going to do it in the reverse order though. So a zero-sum game, it's an economic term that comes out of like game theory. And the idea is that for every winner, there's a loser. For every winning action, there's a losing action, or a contrary or an opposed loss. If I get $1, I got it from somebody. That's zero-sum. Chess is a zero-sum game. I take pieces, you lose pieces. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, not all games are zero-sum. Some games can be ties and so on. So there's also positive sum games and negative sum games, but the key thing about
is it like there's like the pie is like a certain size, and you can't take more than what's
exactly.
Yeah.
And this actually, the pie is a certain size is like deeply embedded in the socialist Marxist worldview. Mm-hmm. Because literally there's a limited number of atoms, limited number of molecules, limited number of resources. And if somebody gets it, then somebody else can't have it. a lot of other conceptions of economics, including like a capitalist conception, be like, actually, we create value by adding work to the value.
Mm-hmm.
And so before there was sand, but now there's glass, and there's more sand, so we can make more glass, and glass is more valuable than sand. We've created value. So when you've got the zero-sum game with winners and losers, and you've also jettisoned morality, because morality, literally all morality is what works to get you ahead, then the question comes down to whom in Lenin's terms. And whom is who does what to whom. And that's how you know if it's right or wrong or not. If I smash you in the face, it's right for me. It advances my causes and goals. It has to, because you have something I want and I can't get it any other way. If you do it to me, then it's wrong. And I have to smash you back to take the stuff back.
Mm-hmm.
Whom. The necessary implication of this is like really a war of my party against your party, my faction against your faction, and against all other factions. And the only acceptable outcome is victory, and any tool necessary is only legitimate but required. You have to use all tools at your disposal to win. There's too much on the line, because if you don't win, you'll be destroyed.
So you always want to be like the actor, right? Like you always want to be the who.
Yeah.
Right.
Never the patient, never the victim.
Yeah.
And this actually explains the vicious infighting that you see among progressives and socialists generally. The worst enemies of the left social revolutionaries in Russia were not like the Mensheviks or the Bolsheviks, but they were the right social revolutionaries, members of the same party.
Yeah.
And the most dreaded enemy of the Bolsheviks weren't the social revolutionaries, but the Mensheviks, the other part of their same party. And then once you get to the part, once they've crushed the Mensheviks, then they can turn their gaze to the social revolutionaries left and right. And once they've done that, they can deal with the cadets, the liberal cadets and the socialist cadets. But the worst enemy is the one closest to you, because they're the ones who are most able to undermine you, and the ones who have easiest access to your stuff. They're going to convince your members to shift over a little bit. This is really, really dark. And this, of course, this isn't morality. This is the collapse, the end of all what most people would consider morality, I think. But for Lenin, it's the guiding principle.
It's putting yourself and your interests first instead of the other person.
Yeah,
the other person first.
And you see this infiltrating, like those the aforementioned environmentalist arsonists, who are certainly a fringe in the environmentalist movement. If you burned their house down, they would not be well pleased with you, and they wouldn't care about your social cause. It wouldn't convince them. And yet they'll do this to you because what they're fighting for is so important that it trumps over everything else.
Yeah.
The question
they're
is,
allowed to buy oil paint to throw on a painting, but you can't buy oil paint to make a painting.
It leads to goofy hypocrisy. I just watched this clip on YouTube the other day with somebody tipped over a carrier, an oil trunk filled with oil, and they tipped it over, spilled the oil everywhere on the street. It's obviously a worse problem. And they were interviewing the driver, and the driver's like, "Yeah, but it's cooking oil." They got so wrapped up in it, they didn't even know what kind of oil they were tipping over.
Oh my gosh, that's so crazy.
This is where you get like this violent destructiveness. But again, for Lenin, that's not a bug; it's a feature. It's not even a feature. It's like it's a purpose.
Yeah, it's like this. You said this yesterday. Like ideology is like when you have like one key that you use like to see the world, and like Lenin gave people like the class struggle key, right? And so you can just like view everything through this lens, and that creates like the it's like if you just have one key, then there's like the one point of tension for the zero sum game. Like it kind of like creates and so this could be class versus like the proletariat versus bourgeoisie, like women versus men, people of color versus white people, and there's not.
Yes, and that's the difference between the National Socialists in Germany in the 30s and the International Socialists in Russia in the 30s. the International Socialists were about class that transcended national boundaries, and the National Socialists were about race that defined national boundaries.
Yeah.
You know, in the modern sex revolutionaries that we've been oppressed by for the last 70 years under the guise of freedom, they've done to sex relations what the National Socialists were doing their best to do to race relations.
Yeah. Well, and the interesting thing is, like, there's like a YouTuber, Kimmy Katiti, who I like, and she talks about when she was like really steeped in this type of thinking, it was like somebody would hold the door open for her. Well, it's because she was Black and they didn't think she was capable of doing it. You know, someone didn't open the door open for her. It was because she was Black and she didn't deserve to have the door open for her. And it was like, no matter what, like everything was because of the racial tension. And it was like, no matter what, it made her have a bad day, you know? So as an individual, it like it made her like very anxious. And it was like at the end of the day, every day she'd had a bad day, you know? So viewing the world this way, like, didn't serve her well, you know, as an individual. But it's interesting because it's like right now we're trying this kind of project where we want to tell, like, it's like, well, women or people of color or whatever, like, have had a disadvantage because men have been favored or white males have been favored or whatever. So we need to like tell white men that they are the scourge of society, you know? And it's just like, I don't know, what's like 25, is that like 25% of our society? Like what is the end game of telling like 20, is that right?
I think white men are closer to 30%, 35%.
Okay. What's the end game in telling, you know, 20 to 30% of our society that they are like useless? Is this going to make our society better for all of us?
It won't make us happy, but it will make us more useful. When you're really angry or really shamed or really fearful, you're very easy to use and manipulate.
Yeah, but you're easy to use and manipulate either way, right? And so it creates a dangerous sector of society. I don't think it's like necessarily creating sheep, you know?
Well, and it's like it's the connection of like there's an idea. So first you have like your ideology that is coloring how you see everything, and it's attached to this. There can be no other explanation, right? This is where the zero sum game is. Like there can be no other explanation but this one. So that feeds back, it feeds into this idea that there are like, I have to be the winner. Yeah. Right. This ideology only explains every part of my experience. And if like, you have to be the loser, because if you're not the loser, then I am the loser.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like this really, really scary interplay between them, because it colors, it means there's only one explanation for every interaction and every experience you have. And then the people who are against you, because, right, they have to be the losers, right? Yeah. The people who don't believe in your ideology or who are the authors of your misery, like, have to be the losers, because you have to be the winner.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think party-think corrodes empathy. And this whom becomes possible in the absence of empathy. But it's funny because they all latch into this phenomena that's pretty well studied by psychologists, I think. I was told this by a friend of mine who's a psychologist. And I can't remember the exact words used, but it's essentially like outsiders, people who feel themselves to be outsiders, attributing to their outsiderness anything bad that happens to them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be like, the example he gave me was like, let's say an Arab American who feels like an outsider is driving down the road and somebody cuts them off. They're like, he probably cut me off because I'm an Arab American.
Right.
Or he probably cut me off because I'm short, or whatever it is that makes me feel like I don't fit in. And in fact, in the car, nobody can tell what race you are. Not while they're busy cutting you off. And I actually heard it the other day. I was on an airplane. And the stewardess was like, to me, felt very, very beset, many concerns. trying to get the plane ready for takeoff. And the guy next to me had a request for her. It was a shared request between the two of us. And she was like, no, just stop, wait till later. And didn't even let him finish his request. And he turned to me and said, she must not like Asians.
Whoa.
And I was like,
but wait a sec, you're not Asian.
As a mom who has said that to my kids, 20 times a day for the last 10 years. Not because I don't like
No, you didn't say she mustn't like Asians. No, you said wait for a second.
Yes,
yeah, I was just
not now.
Yeah. She must not like Asians. Like, you don't look Asian, but you do look like a mom. And I was kind of taken aback by that. And now she was Black, and statistically, there is I think a lot of distrust between those ethnic groups as a whole in the United States. There's a fraught relationship in city life, all that. So I don't think he was being completely irrational, but it was quite a first thing to jump to, I felt.
Yeah. Because it's he's not taking into, did he look and realize she was frenzied and running up and down the aisle? I mean, that's a very easy, context to provide when you're on the plane. It's not
Well, it's interesting because a lot of times, when you take offense at something, you're choosing the
most negative interpretation.
Or not the most obvious interpretation, because that's not the most obvious interpretation.
Right.
Yeah. That's not maybe true in all cases, but whatever. So, anyway.
She came back later on and heard him out and granted his request. And he didn't then say to me, oh, I was wrong. Maybe she doesn't mind Asians after all.
Maybe he did in his mind, though.
Yeah.
Maybe he did. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, maybe. There's a third dynamic here, too, where the request is basically that I move to an empty aisle, 2 rows up to an empty row by myself. So you can have the row with just him and his kid. And I would have my own row. It's a win-win-win. I was just going to get up when the flight... I was just going to get up and move. Yeah. And he's like, oh, we should ask. You know? There was so much interesting dynamic going on there. Sure. It's a little bit of a tangent now.
Sure.
Sorry.
No, I was going to ask, does the adoption of an ideology create this sense of, maybe this is kind of an obvious question, but do you feel like you're in a group against the world? As soon as you adopt an ideology, right? Is it necessary that an ideology pits you against others?
Well, so I don't think Freudianism, for instance, the idea that sex drive underwrites everything. I don't know that Freudians feel beset that way. The sexual revolutionaries who take Freud to his conclusions and apply it to public life, they certainly do. They think everything that happens is trying to restrict their sexual freedom and trying to tell them what to do and blah, blah, blah. But I don't know that it's necessarily built into Freud does not have an us versus them baked into it in a way that socialism does, I think, is my guess. Socialism is literally about class struggle. The Nazis adopted to make it race struggle.
Right.
Our modern revolution is adopted to make it about race struggle or sexual liberation and struggle against the patriarchy. But I don't know that Freudianism as such. There's probably other isms that are properly speaking ideologies I can't think of right now that don't have it. Nietzsche's nihilism certainly has it, because once you've said it's all about power plays, then what else is there but a struggle for power? So.
Yeah. A thing that we touched on the last podcast that Mary and I did, it's are we by using history to defend the Catholic Church, using history as propaganda, creating an ideology out of Catholicism. And I think the thing that strikes me when you talk about it in a zero-sum game is I feel maybe we're in a time where people feel there's new existential threats, and we haven't, there's always been existential threats. It feels right now we're kind of have a number of things that feel new, at least to our generation, or generations that are alive right now. And it's as Catholics, do we feel we need to retreat and circle the wagons? And I remember Pope Francis's encyclical. He had this idea that stood out to me, that it's when you retreat, when you circle the wagons, then you're always protecting your boundary, Yeah. And that's participating in this zero sum. He didn't say this. So just the idea that you're always like protecting your boundaries is interesting to me. That
Well,
was
right,
from
because
Pope
if you
Francis.
have to protect a boundary, it means there's someone out and someone in, and you can
and it's like we're gonna try to take up as much space as we can.
Like we have to take space from other people, or they will take space from us.
Because human nature is what it is. I think ideology in like a kind of the approach that ideologues use creeps into our thinking as Catholics. We're surrounded by false ideologies, and it infects us. I think so. Pope Pius XII hated the word Catholicism because it said it on a plane with all these ideologies, and he said it sells our holy religion short, because our holy religion, but it also oversells it in a way, because all these other ideologies say like it's just economics. Once you understand that, you understand everything
In the world,
right? And no, I've never heard a grown Christian adult say, once you understand the resurrection of Jesus Christ, you understand everything. You no longer need to worry about the mind games of your bank and the fee structures of the tax regime. And I've never heard people say that. Like, actually, our holy religion, I think, probably creates as many difficulties as it solves in some ways. And another guardrails against turning our religion into an ideology, other than the fact that it doesn't claim to answer everything, is that it, whereas the Christian religion kind of piggybacks on the Jewish religion to introduce this idea of an end to history, a goal of history. We're actually really consistent about it. Our religion says it's going to be Jesus that does it. And this is where people who think they're going to guess the end of the world or provoke the end of the world get a little crazy.
It's Jesus that does it, not we can't hasten or slow down.
Right.
Unlike with the progressive Marxist history.
Yeah. From Hegel on all the way through Marx and Mao. Yeah. Like they see it as both inevitable, but as something that's at jeopardy from the bad guys. And of course, we've discussed how they don't really see it as at jeopardy. And they probably don't even really see it at all. They just need a group to target to make into an enemy so that the people are afraid to stray from control. And if the Catholic Church is trying to control anything, it's really terrible at controlling it. They can't control the local parish secretary, let alone who will freely write those letters of whether you're a parishioner or not at her own discretion. But I think, this idea that Jesus actually does it and we can't, like, you've kind of strayed from the Christian understanding of the world when you start saying, I need to go out and like start causing this revolution. And for that matter, we don't see it as an earthly thing. We see it as something that's it's going to be transcendence, interrupting the imminent in the same way that the incarnation did.
And so there is a quote progression towards the end because Christ will come, right? But we're not, our relationship to the end of time, like, is not really different, like, to the relationship, like, because the end of time is judgment. Like, we have the same, we will be judged just as the people 700 years ago are judged. So there's no like, oh, well, we're further along. We may be closer to the end of time because time is, progressing. But like in terms of like that judgment piece, which is really what the end of the world is about, right? The coming of Christ, like we're no better or worse off than people 700 years ago.
And this is and there's not I don't need to worry about my children's judgment. God is going to judge me way more discerningly than my grandchildren.
Yeah, you're right. Right.
Yeah. Your children's judgment will also be like a moving target. Whereas like it's not like an idea we're moving to that we're crafting.
Yes. It's not an idea we're moving to. A thing that we think is better than what we have now. We're moving towards a person.
Yeah.
That's better. That's the best.
Who's the alpha and the omega?
I'm going to, I really want to flip this whom question on its head, right? So Lenin always put himself as the who, right? Like, But so it's like, oh, well, I'm the actor, right? I'm the one that's going to take something from you. You're my direct object. You're my whom, right? I'm going to take this from you. If we, as Christians in time, make Jesus the who, right? We become the people that are being acted upon.
We become the patients of adoption.
We become the patients, right? We become the recipients of his action, right? We become we're the recipients of his grace through the crucifixion and resurrection.
Yeah. Well, that's something a material worldview has no room for. Like, literally, grace is not a material thing. Grace is, to put it in Aristotelian terms, a formal thing. It's a metaphysical thing. It's a beyond mere nature. And a Christian would say it's the life of God shared with men, with mortals. And it's also what enables us to like turn the other cheek, to be forgiving, to be kind when somebody's hard to be kind to, when there's kind of scratchy, and there's no room for any of that in Leninthink. There's just smash or be smashed.
Yeah. And it's the opposite. I love both of these ideas. The opposite of do unto others, like it's like the
Right.
But I think we should end here.
Yeah.
That was really interesting, guys. Please like, subscribe, and share our podcast. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, guys.
And
thank you.
See you later.